Shaq was boarding a private jet when he saw a respected black pilot being harassed by an arrogant cop. The officer shouted, "There's no way this guy owns that jet. It's stolen." The crowd froze. Cameras started rolling, and Shaq knew instantly he had to step in. But what Shaq did next not only destroyed the cop's career, it changed everything about justice in America. Keep watching because what Shaq does next will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Captain Marcus Reed adjusted his uniform, feeling pride swell in his chest as he approached the stairs of his gleaming private jet. Morning sunlight illuminated the polished aircraft, symbolizing years of hard work and sacrifice. But before Marcus could take another step, a loud, authoritative voice shattered the calm. "Hold it right there!" Officer Trent barked, rapidly approaching with his hand hovering menacingly near his holster. Marcus turned slowly, confusion etched across his face. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked calmly, aware of the curious eyes now trained on them. Several passengers nearby subtly reached for their phones, sensing trouble. Officer Trent eyed Marcus up and down disdainfully, his lip curling into a sneer. "What exactly do you think you're doing boarding this jet?" Marcus maintained his composure, calmly retrieving his identification from his jacket pocket. "I'm preparing to fly my aircraft, officer. Here are my credentials." Trent barely glanced at the documents before dismissively waving them away. "You really expect me to believe someone like you owns a private jet? Looks to me like you're stealing it." The silence following Trent's accusation was deafening. Passengers glanced at each other in shock, but nobody dared speak up. Marcus clenched his jaw, frustration rising beneath his calm exterior. "Officer, if you just look at the paperwork," Marcus began evenly. "I've seen enough," Trent interrupted loudly, relishing the attention. "You're not going anywhere until we get to the bottom of this." Just as Marcus took a deep breath, contemplating his next move, a shadow fell across the scene. From the crowd emerged a towering figure, Shaquille O'Neal. His presence alone commanded attention, and whispers rippled through the gathering crowd. Shaq stepped calmly between Marcus and Trent, arms folded firmly across his chest. "Is there a reason you're harassing this man, officer?" Trent stiffened, his confidence momentarily shaken by Shaq's imposing stature. He quickly recovered, though his voice wavered slightly. "This doesn't involve you. I'm conducting official police business. Looks more like profiling to me," Shaq responded, his deep voice resonating clearly. "Watch it," Trent snapped angrily. "Don't think your celebrity status means anything here." Shaq raised an eyebrow, leaning slightly toward the officer, his gaze unflinching. "You might want to rethink what you're doing right now." A tense silence gripped the scene. Marcus stood still, gratitude mixing with concern. Cameras continued capturing the tense standoff, the footage quietly spreading across social media. Trent swallowed hard, anger battling uncertainty on his face. Marcus recognized the look, a cornered man deciding whether to back down or escalate. For a brief, dangerous moment, nobody moved. Finally, Trent stepped back, pointing sharply at Marcus. "This isn't over." As the officer turned away, Marcus exhaled deeply, realizing the danger he'd narrowly avoided. Shaq turned toward him with a reassuring nod, but Marcus could see the gravity in Shaq's eyes. "You all right?" Shaq asked gently. "Thanks to you," Marcus replied gratefully. "But I'm worried he's not finished." Shaq glanced back at Trent's retreating figure. His expression hardened. "Neither am I." Passengers murmured among themselves, still recording every second. Marcus knew the confrontation had only just begun. Officer Trent would be back, but this time, Marcus wouldn't be facing him alone. Shaq placed a comforting hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Trust me, we've got this." Marcus nodded slowly, his resolve strengthening. Yet deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident would soon ignite a firestorm bigger than either of them could imagine. Shaq's gaze locked onto Officer Trent, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's picked the wrong fight." Marcus swallowed hard, knowing Shaq was right. The battle lines were drawn, and there was no turning back now. Shaq squared his massive shoulders, stepping fully between Officer Trent and Marcus. His eyes narrowed in a protective glare. "You need to back off," Shaq warned, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the murmurs of the passengers who had gathered, phones held high. Trent laughed mockingly, clearly unfazed. "Oh, so you're his lawyer now? Or just some celebrity looking for attention?" Shaq didn't flinch. "I'm someone who won't stand by while you bully an innocent man. Check your ego, officer." The confrontation sent a wave of tension rippling through the crowd. People pressed closer, their screens glowing brighter, capturing every word, every breath, every flicker of emotion. Marcus stood behind Shaq, heart racing, anger and gratitude mixing uneasily in his chest. He wanted to speak, but Shaq's unwavering presence kept him steady. Officer Trent's face twisted with irritation as he reached aggressively for his radio. "I need backup immediately. I've got two aggressive individuals causing a scene." Shaq raised an eyebrow calmly. "Aggressive? You sure about that?" Moments later, a second patrol car screeched into the tarmac area, its blue lights pulsing against the shiny jet. Two officers emerged quickly, striding toward Trent. Trent smirked, clearly expecting their support. "Now we'll see who's right." But the older officer, Captain Roberts, looked deeply annoyed as he approached. "Trent, what's going on here?" Roberts asked sternly, glancing cautiously at Shaq and Marcus. Trent jabbed a finger accusingly toward Marcus. "This guy claims it's his jet. Obvious lie. And Shaq here, he's obstructing." Captain Roberts glanced at Marcus, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Captain Reed? The pilot? Of course this is his jet," he snapped at Trent. "We trained together. He's one of the best pilots around." The color drained from Trent's face as his arrogant confidence shattered instantly. Shaq folded his arms silently, a subtle yet powerful smirk crossing his lips. Marcus exhaled sharply, relief flooding his senses. "Trent!" Roberts barked harshly. "You've just publicly embarrassed this department. Again." Passengers around them whispered excitedly, phones shaking slightly as they filmed the explosive scene unfolding. Trent's face turned a deep shade of crimson, eyes darting between Roberts, Shaq, and Marcus, fury blazing. "I'm not apologizing to either of them," Trent spat defiantly. "They made fools of us." "No, you did that all by yourself," Shaq replied calmly. Trent glared back, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You two will regret this, I promise." Marcus felt a cold shiver race down his spine. Shaq remained motionless, but even he sensed the raw threat beneath Trent's furious words. Within minutes, the footage ignited a wildfire across social media, and Trent had no idea the storm heading his way. Millions watched in disbelief as the video spread. Captain Marcus Reed, a respected black pilot, being publicly humiliated by Officer Trent. The internet erupted with fury, hashtags like number justice for Marcus and number N racial profiling trending worldwide. Notifications poured into Marcus's phone relentlessly as he sat inside his jet, processing the surreal moment. Colleagues from his airline immediately rallied behind him, tweeting their support and demanding Trent be held accountable. One tweet stood out to Marcus. "Captain Reed trained me. He's a man of integrity." Officer Trent crossed the line. "We stand with Marcus." Meanwhile, Shaq stood at the edge of the tarmac, glancing down at his phone, his jaw tightening as he read the thousands of comments pouring in. He looked up at Marcus, nodding reassuringly. "Don't worry," Shaq called out firmly. "I promise, this won't end here." Across town, Officer Trent's phone buzzed incessantly, each notification more alarming than the last. His heart pounded in confusion and anger as he scanned the endless wave of outrage directed at him. A sinking dread tightened his chest. This had spiraled far beyond anything he anticipated. His phone suddenly vibrated again, this time displaying the name he'd feared most, Chief Monroe. With a deep breath, Trent answered shakily. "Hello?" Monroe's voice thundered through the line, sharp and furious. "Trent, my office, now. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've made this entire department look like fools." Trent swallowed hard, beads of sweat rolling down his forehead. He felt cornered, the walls closing in fast. "Sir, it's all a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Monroe's voice roared through the speaker. "The entire country just saw you humiliate an innocent man. This department is being torn apart online because of your reckless stupidity." Back at the airport, Shaq stood calmly beside Marcus, speaking quietly into his phone. "I need everything you can find on Officer Trent. Every arrest, every complaint, especially the ones buried deep. Leave no stone unturned." Marcus watched Shaq closely, feeling both gratitude and unease. The pilot knew this incident was no longer just about him. It had become a nationwide rallying cry against injustice. Shaq ended the call and glanced reassuringly at Marcus. "We're going to make sure he never does this again." Marcus nodded silently, but inside he wondered just how far Trent might go to retaliate. Shaq stared into the distance, his eyes intense. He messed with the wrong pilot and the wrong ally. Marcus's pulse quickened, suddenly, aware of the dangerous path they had stepped onto. Shaq's investigation didn't just open a door, It ripped it from its hinges, exposing a dark and disturbing truth Officer Trent had desperately tried to hide. Within days, Shaq's private team unearthed records of Trent's misconduct, a chilling pattern of racial harassment buried deep within departmental archives. What began as whispers quickly became screams of outrage as victims courageously stepped into the spotlight, sharing haunting stories that painted Trent as not just an arrogant cop, but a man who took pleasure in abusing power. One victim, a soft-spoken teacher named Vanessa, sat trembling before the cameras, tears streaming silently down her face as she recounted her traumatic encounter. "He stopped me for a broken taillight," she began quietly, voice shaking. "Then he humiliated me, accused me of stealing my own car, all because of the color of my skin." Social media ignited once again, this time with a unified demand for justice. Officer Trent's name trended worldwide, not as a symbol of authority, but as the embodiment of unchecked racism. The public was relentless, each revelation amplifying the fury directed at Trent, and now the entire police department itself. Chief Monroe found himself cornered by reporters outside the precinct, desperate to distance himself from Trent's toxic shadow. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and Monroe, sweating under the bright lights, finally surrendered to pressure. "Officer Trent has been suspended. Effective immediately," he announced grimly. "This department stands firmly against racial discrimination." Across town, Trent watched the announcement from his dimly lit apartment, his knuckles white as he gripped a bottle tightly. His reputation was shattered, his badge stripped away, everything he'd built destroyed in days. His blood boiled as he hurled the bottle against the wall, shattering it into shards of glass in rage. "Marcus," Trent hissed, eyes glazed with fury, "you did this. You ruined everything." At a massive press conference downtown, Shaq stepped forward, microphones thrust towards him from every direction. His voice steady but sharp, he looked straight into the cameras. "Officer Trent is just one part of a broken system. We demand a deeper investigation, not just into his conduct, but into everyone who enabled him." Cheers erupted from the crowd, Marcus standing just behind Shaq, silently absorbing the gravity of the moment. But a chill ran down his spine, a sixth sense that trouble wasn't far away. Hours later, Marcus returned home, exhausted from the relentless spotlight. He locked his door, turning on lights throughout his house to shake off the eerie feeling that someone was watching. Outside, shadows shifted silently across his lawn, the soft crunch of footsteps hidden beneath the rustling leaves. Trent stood hidden in darkness, eyes narrowed, heart racing with adrenaline-fueled anger. His breathing grew heavy as he watched Marcus through the window, a twisted smile forming on his lips. The officer was no longer driven by pride or arrogance, only raw, desperate vengeance. "You think you can destroy me, Marcus?" Trent whispered to himself. "Let's see how brave you are when it's just you and me." Inside, Marcus hesitated at the window, sensing something ominous lurking just beyond his sight. A cold dread filled him. Trent was out there. He felt it deep in his bones. He had no idea just how right he was. Marcus froze as a loud crash echoed through the darkness outside his home, glass shattering like a violent storm. His heart raced. He could feel every beat pounding in his ears as the front door rattled under heavy blows. "Reed, open up!" A familiar voice roared, distorted by anger and desperation. Marcus knew instantly who it was. Officer Trent. Breathing sharply, Marcus quietly activated his phone camera, switching to live stream mode. If Trent was going to threaten him again, he wanted the whole world to see it. The door burst open, splintering wood flying through the air. Officer Trent stood silhouetted in the doorway, his face twisted in furious desperation, eyes wild and unfocused. His once proud uniform was disheveled, his badge noticeably missing. "You thought you could take everything from me and walk away?" Trent growled, stepping forward menacingly. Marcus backed away slowly, raising his hands defensively. "Stay calm, Trent," Marcus said steadily, masking the tremor in his voice. "You're making things worse for yourself." Trent let out a bitter laugh, rage dripping from every word. "I have nothing left to lose. Thanks to you. You and your billionaire friend think you own this town?" Marcus's hand slipped subtly into his jacket pocket, his fingers fumbling to activate the hidden live stream on his phone. Thousands of viewers instantly tuned in, unknowingly becoming witnesses to Trent's downfall. "Officer Trent," Marcus began calmly, eyes locked onto Trent's trembling fists. "You did this to yourself. All you had to do was respect me. Respect anyone. This is your doing." Trent lunged suddenly, grabbing Marcus roughly by the collar, pushing him against the wall. Marcus winced, feeling the cold drywall press against his back, Trent's face inches from his own. "You don't get it, do you? You ruined my life," Trent shouted, spit flying. "I'm gonna make sure you never fly again." Marcus stayed defiant, chin raised, refusing to break eye contact. "You're live right now, Trent. Thousands are watching you destroy whatever's left of your career." Trent hesitated, confusion flashing across his eyes. Marcus saw panic settling in, deep, consuming panic, as Trent glanced frantically around the room, noticing the phone blinking in Marcus's pocket. "No!" Trent whispered, stumbling backward, eyes wide with disbelief. Sirens wailed in the distance, the piercing noise cutting through the tense silence. Blue and red lights flashed through the shattered doorway, illuminating Trent's face with shadows of fear and defeat. Two officers burst inside, weapons drawn. "Hands up, Trent!" Trent staggered backward, the reality of his actions finally dawning. He raised trembling hands, expression collapsing into despair. As cuffs snapped around his wrists, Marcus exhaled deeply, a heavy weight lifting from his chest. Outside, neighbors had gathered, phones raised, capturing every humiliating detail. Trent was roughly led past Marcus, shoulders slumped in disgrace, his bitter gaze fixed firmly on the pilot. "This isn't over," Trent hissed as they dragged him away. "I swear, Reed, I'll ruin Shaq too." Marcus stood silently, watching the once powerful officer reduced to a desperate, broken man. He felt no satisfaction, only sadness and exhaustion. But deep within, he knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. As the live stream ended, messages flooded Marcus's phone. Supportive texts, shocked reactions, and news alerts. Suddenly, his screen flashed with a call from Shaq. "You okay?" Shaq asked immediately, voice tense with concern. Marcus sighed heavily, voice steady despite trembling hands. "Yeah, I'm good. But Trent, he's coming after you next." Shaq chuckled darkly. "Let him try." Marcus glanced outside at the retreating squad cars, his nerves still raw, knowing the storm was far from over. Shaq's eyes widened as he scanned through the documents on his desk, disbelief turning quickly into anger. He'd expected corruption, but never imagined it went this deep. He flipped through page after page, reading names of officers who had quietly shielded Trent, covering up his racism for years. The police chief himself had approved transfers and promotions, knowing full well what Trent was capable of. "Unbelievable," Shaq muttered, rubbing his forehead as frustration simmered inside him. He reached for his phone, calling Marcus immediately. Marcus answered quickly, voice tense. "Did you find something?" Shaq exhaled heavily. "It's worse than we thought." Trent was protected by high-ranking officers, including the chief. Marcus was silent for a moment before quietly asking, "So what do we do now?" Shaq's voice hardened, determination shining through. "We go public. Everyone needs to see how deep this rot goes." Within hours, Shaq held a press conference. Cameras flashed as he stepped up confidently to the podium, his towering figure radiating strength and authority. He stared directly into the sea of reporters, their anxious murmurs falling silent. "Today," Shaq began firmly, "I'm exposing not just one corrupt officer, but an entire system." Officer Trent was protected by powerful men who turned a blind eye to racism and injustice. It's time we hold every single one of them accountable. The crowd erupted in outrage as Shaq detailed the shocking evidence, reading names and exposing backdoor deals. Within hours, news spread nationwide, igniting a wave of anger. Protests formed outside the police station, demanding immediate action. Forced by mounting pressure, the police chief publicly resigned that afternoon, his once respected reputation shattered. As officers walked out of headquarters, protesters shouted furiously, "Justice for Marcus! Reform now!" Marcus stood beside Shaq, silently watching the chaos unfold. Cameras captured his steady resolve, his face becoming a symbol of resistance and strength. Across the nation, Marcus's image flooded social media, transforming him into an icon in the fight against injustice. Meanwhile, Trent watched from his cramped cell, abandoned by former friends and allies. Each headline worsened his bitterness, fueling a dangerous fury. Alone and isolated, he paced, his thoughts spiraling into desperation. That evening, as Shaq wrapped up an exhausting day of interviews and meetings, his phone lit up with an unknown number. "Curious," he answered cautiously. A distorted voice whispered menacingly, "You think you won? Watch your back, Shaq. This ends with you." Shaq's eyes narrowed, pulse quickening as the line went dead. The crowd buzzed with excitement as Shaq took the stage, the bright lights illuminating his towering presence. Cameras flashed, capturing every moment of what promised to be a historic speech. But beneath the sea of smiles and applause, danger lurked unnoticed. Men hired by Trent waited silently among the spectators, eyes fixed coldly on their target. Shaq adjusted the microphone, his deep voice filling the packed auditorium. "We stand here today united," he declared passionately, "because justice is not optional, it's essential." Applause echoed, masking the subtle movement at the edges of the audience. A man, dressed casually but eyes cold as steel, nodded subtly to his companions, signaling it was time. He slowly moved forward, slipping quietly through the crowd. Each step brought him closer to Shaq, fingers gripping something concealed beneath his jacket. But a sharp-eyed security officer spotted the suspicious figure. He spoke urgently into his radio, quickly alerting the team. "We have movement, front left quadrant. Suspect approaching stage." Shaq continued, unaware of the threat rapidly closing in. "Together we must dismantle systemic racism." Suddenly, chaos erupted. The man lunged towards Shaq, his hand emerging from his jacket holding a gleaming blade. Gasps filled the air. Shaq turned just in time, his eyes widening in shock, heart pounding as the attacker drew dangerously close. Security tackled the attacker just inches from Shaq, wrestling him violently to the floor. Shaq stumbled back, his chest heaving with adrenaline. Screams echoed throughout the auditorium as the live broadcast captured every terrifying moment. The second attacker, previously hidden in the shadows, bolted towards Shaq from the opposite side. Panic surged through the room. Shaq instinctively braced himself, preparing for impact. But another guard swiftly intercepted the man, pinning him to the ground forcefully. The attackers struggled fiercely, but security quickly subdued them, handcuffing the assailants as the audience stared in horror and disbelief. Shaq straightened, his eyes fierce but calm. Stepping back to the microphone, he steadied his breath and addressed the shaken audience, his voice steady and firm. "This is exactly what we're fighting against. Violence can't silence justice." Within moments, footage of the attack went viral nationwide, millions watching in horror at the brazen attempt on Shaq's life. The public was furious, the outcry deafening. Hours later, federal agents stormed Trent's jail cell. They found him pacing nervously, eyes darting as the FBI approached. "Officer Trent, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder," one agent announced coldly, the words hitting Trent like a sledgehammer. Trent shouted desperately, struggling against the agents, his face twisted in bitter defeat. "You can't do this to me. I'm a cop." "Not anymore," the agent replied coldly, dragging Trent away as cameras captured his humiliation for the world to witness. Later, Shaq sat quietly backstage, absorbing the gravity of the day. Marcus joined him, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" Shaq nodded slowly, determination filling his voice. "Better than ever. They just made me even stronger." Marcus smiled, deeply moved by Shaq's resilience. Rising confidently, Shaq returned to the stage amid thunderous applause. He looked directly into the cameras, his voice ringing with conviction. "Today's attack proves how far some will go to stop change, but they're too late. Tomorrow I announce a groundbreaking initiative that will change everything." The crowd roared in approval, eager to see what Shaq planned next. The auditorium was packed wall to wall, anticipation palpable in the air. Cameras from every major news network fixed on Shaq as he confidently stepped onto the stage, determination radiating from every move. He approached the microphone, and the room instantly fell silent, waiting for his words. "Today," Shaq began firmly, "we change not just policy, but history." He paused for effect, eyes scanning the crowd as everyone leaned forward, captivated. "I'm proud to announce a groundbreaking, multi-million-dollar initiative dedicated to mandatory, nationwide anti-discrimination training for every law enforcement officer in America. We won't wait for another tragedy. We act today." The audience erupted, a thunderous roar echoing through the auditorium. Cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing this pivotal moment. Across the country, news spread like wildfire. Social media overflowed with praise and gratitude. Communities previously divided stood united behind Shaq's powerful leadership. Politicians and celebrities voiced overwhelming support, demanding immediate implementation. Marcus stood just off stage, heart swelling with pride. Reporters quickly surrounded him, microphones thrust forward eagerly. One reporter shouted, "Captain Reed, how does it feel knowing your experience sparked this historic moment?" Marcus smiled, A mixture of humility and courage reflected in his eyes. It's not about me. It's about ensuring no one else goes through this again. The crowd applauded, deeply moved by Marcus's heartfelt sincerity. Meanwhile, Trent sat silently in a courtroom miles away, chained and humiliated, watching the initiatives launch live on television. His shoulders slumped, eyes hollow with despair, as the judge read through multiple serious charges. Officer Trent, your actions have disgraced your badge, and you now face severe legal consequences, the judge announced firmly. Trent clenched his fists, bitterness etched deeply into his face. He desperately scanned the courtroom for allies but saw only disgusted looks and cold glares. Back at the press conference, Shaq proudly raised Marcus's hand. This man symbolizes courage and strength. He is not a victim. He is a hero, and he's why we're here today. The auditorium erupted once more, applause deafening as Marcus nodded humbly. Trent's eyes filled with tears of anger and self-pity, realizing he'd become the villain in a narrative he could no longer control. As the judge detailed his potential punishment, Trent suddenly stood, voice breaking emotionally. I never meant, it wasn't supposed to be like this. The courtroom froze, shocked at Trent's sudden outburst. The judge sternly ordered him to sit, but Trent's defiant composure crumbled completely, openly sobbing as cameras captured every devastating moment. The courtroom was packed to capacity, tension thick in the air, as Officer Trent stood defeated before the judge. Cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing the anguish etched deeply into Trent's pale, trembling face. Marcus sat silently in the front row, his expression steady, eyes fixed firmly on Trent, watching justice unfold. The judge's voice resonated powerfully through the room. Officer Trent, your reckless actions, abuse of power, and clear racial discrimination have disgraced the uniform you wore. You have betrayed public trust and damaged countless lives. Trent visibly winced, his arrogance now replaced by desperation and shame. He glanced briefly at Marcus, eyes filled with a bitterness he could barely conceal. Marcus met his gaze calmly, unafraid, and Trent quickly looked away, defeated. The judge leaned forward, his words deliberate and heavy. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The room erupted into hushed murmurs, the severity of the sentence catching many by surprise. Trent's legs buckled slightly, gripping the edge of the table for support. Marcus exhaled slowly, relief and vindication washing over him, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in months. Outside the courtroom, crowds gathered, chanting Marcus's name, applauding the long-awaited justice. News cameras swarmed Shaq as he exited, microphones thrust forward aggressively. A reporter asked, Shaq, do you feel justice was truly served today? Shaq nodded firmly, his deep voice steady and powerful. Today marks a significant step forward. But let's be clear, this isn't the end. We have much more work ahead. Across town, Trent's past victims embraced, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Finally, whispered a young woman emotionally, he can't hurt anyone else. Marcus stood quietly near the courthouse steps, overwhelmed by the emotional scene around him. Shaq approached him from behind, placing a comforting hand gently on his shoulder. Marcus turned, gratitude clear in his tired eyes. Marcus, Shaq began softly, you've endured more than anyone should. You stood strong, even when it seemed impossible. Marcus smiled faintly, nodding slowly. I had to, for all the ones who never got justice. Shaq's eyes glistened with pride. Well, I'm not done fighting, and I have another surprise for you. A big one. Marcus tilted his head curiously, eyebrows raised. Another surprise. Shaq nodded, leaning in closer. Meet me privately tomorrow. Trust me, this is an offer that's going to change everything. Marcus stood in stunned silence as Shaq slid a set of polished golden keys into his hand. They stood outside a sleek, newly constructed building, its modern design sparkling under the bright midday sun. Marcus looked up, eyes wide with disbelief, at the large, bold sign above the entrance that read, Captain Marcus Reed, Aviation Training Academy. This can't be real, Marcus stammered, his voice thick with emotion. Shaq smiled warmly, patting Marcus's shoulder reassuringly. It's very real. This is yours now. You've earned it, Marcus. Now it's your turn to open the skies for others. Marcus's fingers trembled around the keys, tears threatening to fall as he absorbed the weight of the moment. Around them, camera flashes illuminated their faces, reporters capturing every detail. A journalist stepped forward, microphone extended, excitement evident in her voice. Marcus, What does this mean to you personally? From being falsely accused to owning your own academy? Can you describe your feelings? Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts carefully. The memories of Officer Trent's cruel accusations flashed briefly through his mind, but he quickly replaced them with the faces of countless young, aspiring pilots who looked just like him. Faces full of hope. It means everything, Marcus said, his voice steady yet emotional. This academy symbolizes something far bigger than me. It represents hope, resilience, and most importantly, opportunity. It's proof that no one can define your limits except you. His words resonated powerfully, drawing enthusiastic applause from the growing crowd. Cameras zoomed in on Shaq, who nodded proudly, clearly moved by Marcus's heartfelt words. News outlets broadcast the event live, headlines rapidly emerging. Shaq empowers wrong pilot, ignites dreams nationwide. Across town in a stark prison cell, Officer Trent watched the broadcast bitterly, his jaw clenched in anger as he stared at Marcus's triumphant face on the small screen. Trent had lost everything, his badge, his reputation, his freedom. The reality of his complete defeat settled in, stinging deeply. Marcus's success was now a constant reminder of Trent's shameful downfall. Back at the academy, Shaq guided Marcus on a private tour inside. The hallways were lined with state-of-the-art flight simulators, gleaming classrooms, and vibrant images showcasing diverse pilots confidently standing next to aircraft. Marcus paused at one of the photos, gently touching the glass with his fingertips. "I want this academy to inspire generations," Marcus whispered, determination strengthening his voice. "Kids who never imagined they could fly, who thought the sky was out of their reach." Shaq nodded, his voice resonant with conviction. "That's exactly why I chose you, Marcus. You're the kind of leader they need." Marcus turned, sincerity shining in his eyes. "I promise you, Shaq, I won't let you down. I'm going to expand this opportunity nationwide, making sure every young pilot knows that dreams can soar." Suddenly, Marcus's phone vibrated sharply, breaking the intense moment. He glanced at the caller ID, eyebrows knitting with confusion. "Excuse me," Marcus said, stepping aside to answer the call. He placed the phone to his ear cautiously. "Hello?" A voice spoke rapidly, filled with excitement and urgency. Marcus's eyes widened as he listened, his expression shifting from curiosity to astonishment. You're serious?" Marcus asked, nearly breathless with shock. Shaq looked at him, puzzled. Marcus slowly lowered his phone, eyes shining with disbelief and wonder. "Who was that?" Shaq asked, stepping closer, intrigued. Marcus turned, barely able to contain his excitement. "Shaq, I've just been invited to speak at the National Conference on Equality and Justice." Shaq smiled broadly, a knowing twinkle in his eyes. "And that's just the beginning." Marcus stood confidently at the podium, lights from countless cameras reflecting in his eyes. Millions watched nationwide, holding their breath, as Marcus took a deep, steadying breath and spoke into the microphone. "My name is Captain Marcus Reed, and I was once accused of a crime, my only real crime being born black," Marcus began, his voice strong yet filled with emotion. "But today I stand here, not as a victim, but as proof that courage and truth can prevail against hate." As he spoke, Shaq watched proudly from the front row, his eyes glistening with pride. He saw Marcus transform from a wrong pilot into a beacon of hope, a true voice for change. Shaq smiled gently, recognizing the momentous shift unfolding in real time. Marcus continued, his voice rising with intensity and conviction. "We must never accept a system that allows prejudice to silence dreams. Each of us, no matter our color, no matter our background, has a right to reach for the sky. My dream was nearly stolen from me by ignorance and hate, but thanks to unwavering support from people like Shaquille O'Neal, I reclaimed my path. Now my mission is simple, to lift others who face the same barriers." As Marcus spoke, millions at home felt chills run down their spines, his powerful words touching hearts across the nation. Messages poured onto social media, praising Marcus's courage and vowing solidarity in the fight against racial injustice. The pilot who had once been humiliated was now a national hero. Inside a stark prison cell, Trent watched Marcus speak on a flickering TV screen. Once powerful and arrogant, Trent now sat hunched over, broken and forgotten. As Marcus's speech rang through the tiny cell, the former officer finally understood the true scale of his downfall. His bitter prejudices had not only destroyed his life, but had also sparked a movement larger than he ever imagined. Back at the conference, applause erupted as Marcus concluded his heartfelt speech. Shaq rose first, clapping passionately, prompting a standing ovation from the entire auditorium. Cameras flashed, reporters capturing the historical moment. Amid the applause, Shaq stepped onto the stage, approaching Marcus with a knowing grin. Marcus, puzzled yet curious, watched as Shaq reached for the microphone. "Marcus," Shaq began, eyes twinkling mysteriously, "your words tonight reminded me why our fight is never truly done. To honor your bravery and leadership, I'm proud to announce the creation of a new foundation." Marcus stared in shock, his heart racing. "What foundation?" Shaq smiled, raising his voice so all could hear clearly. "The Marcus Reed Foundation, a movement dedicated to ensuring no one ever endures what you faced." Marcus stood speechless, emotions overwhelming him, as thunderous applause filled the room once again. Shaq stood at the center of the grand stage, cameras flashing around him like lightning. He paused, looking out over the vast sea of faces filled with hope and determination. The anticipation in the air was electric, the audience hanging on his every word. "Today isn't just about one man's struggle," Shaq began, his deep voice echoing powerfully throughout the hall. "It's about all of us, standing together against injustice, proving that unity can defeat hate." As he spoke, the backdrop behind him illuminated dramatically, revealing the name, the Marcus Reed Foundation. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by thunderous applause. Marcus, standing nearby, felt tears sting his eyes as he absorbed the enormity of Shaq's gesture. Shaq raised his hand gently, quieting the audience as he continued passionately, "This foundation will provide not just hope, but opportunities, real opportunities, for minorities across the nation, because no one should ever experience what Marcus endured." The announcement spread instantly, dominating headlines worldwide. Donations poured in from every corner of the globe, celebrities pledged their support, and Marcus Reed's Aviation Academy quickly became the shining jewel of the foundation. Pilots from diverse backgrounds flooded its doors, each inspired by Marcus's powerful story of resilience and triumph. Inside the cold silence of his prison cell, Trent watched the news coverage numbly. His face, once so arrogant and cruel, was now weary and defeated. He realized bitterly that his own hateful actions had made Marcus an icon and Shaq a national hero. Trent had become nothing more than a cautionary tale, a forgotten shadow, powerless to influence anything beyond his tiny cell. Back on stage, Marcus approached Shaq, their eyes meeting in a profound moment of understanding. Shaq smiled warmly, clasping Marcus's shoulder tightly. "You've changed everything, Marcus," Shaq said softly, pride glowing in his eyes. "Never underestimate the power your story holds." Marcus nodded emotionally, his voice choked with gratitude. "None of this would have been possible without you believing in me." Shaq shook his head, gently correcting him. "No, Marcus. It happened because you refused to let hatred define you." As the audience erupted once more into applause, Shaq faced the cameras, delivering his final powerful message, his voice unwavering. "Racism ends when we decide justice matters. Today we've made that decision." His words resonated around the world, igniting a movement that would last generations.